Hello. In this video, we're going to review how to use colons and semicolons on their own and then also in combination with one another in order to make a list of items. Let's get started. We're all familiar with punctuation marks that can end lines. The semicolon is one of these things that can end stop a clause or a line. Alongside exclamation points, periods, and question marks, semicolons can end stop a clause, a line, or a sentence. M dashes are in their middle category. Occasionally, M dashes can end a line. This is the case, of course, with aposiopesis, but they occupy a kind of middle ground. Commas, of course, can't end a line. They can only separate clauses or phrases from one another. We're already familiar with, as I've said, the period, the exclamation point, and the question mark. That just leaves the semicolon. The semicolon is functionally and grammatically equivalent to these three markings. You should treat them like periods, and they work in a similar kind of fashion. They're not the same, and this is very important, as commas, colons, or any kind of dash. They're not, in other words, functionally equivalent. Let's zoom in on semicolons for a moment in order to formulate some guidelines that can govern our use of them. Semicolons and periods, as I've mentioned, are functionally equivalent. That said, when you're using a semicolon, obviously you have to have something equal on the other end of it, because you're not creating a whole new sentence and you're simply connecting the two in a kind of semicolon splice-like fashion. The important thing to remember is that it's conjoining two things that are essentially equal. So we have now a few ways to conjoin two independent clauses to one another. The first, obviously, is using our dynamic duo. So a comma and then some kind of coordinating conjunction. Our second method is to employ two periods, one at the end of the first independent clause, the other at the end of the second. And our third way, which is the way that we're learning how to navigate right now, is putting a semicolon in between the two independent clauses, then putting a period at the end of the second independent clause. So you have a sentence, semicolon, sentence, period. You use a semicolon and instead of a period when the two things that are on either side of the punctuation mark are related. So it's not, I guess, just that they're equal, they're also related to one another. Okay, now that we have our first row out of the way, let's add a second type of punctuation mark to that intermediate spot. So alongside the M dash, we have the colon. Neither of these marks ends a line or a sentence, but they also don't function in a similar way. They also don't function the same way commas function. So again, they're in a kind of intermediate class. The first set governs, of course, only independent clauses' relations with other independent clauses. The final set, so commas, govern the relationship between independent and dependent clauses, or if we're going to be a little bit more broad, any kind of clause that's not a full independent clause. It also, as is the case with our dynamic duo, governs some independent clauses' relations with other similar independent clauses. This leaves, of course, our middle set. I'll note that these operate much more like the commas than they do the line-ending punctuation marks. So keep that in mind. They're not strong nor are they weak. They're somewhere in between. Certainly more strong than a comma, but not quite as strong as a line-ending punctuation mark. Within this middle set, we have two varieties, the M dash and the colon. We've already focused on the M dash, so let's think about the colon a little bit more carefully. I like to view the colon as a punctuation mark that serves above all, introductory function. Within this introductory function set are two sub-functions, if you will. The first is to outline some kind of consequential relation between what comes before the colon and then what comes just after it. In this function, the colon relates two independent clauses or phrases to one another. The second introductory function the colon can serve is by introducing a list or a quotation or some kind of example on the right side of the colon. Let's slow down with both of these introductory functions a little bit more. So we have our colon, and we have whatever comes before it as chunk A, and then, of course, whatever comes after it as chunk B. If we're thinking about the consequential relation between independent clauses or phrases, we can, on the top of this chunk section, we have an independent clause, colon, independent clause. Generally speaking, the two independent clauses aren't totally equal. They're definitely related, and in syntactically, to the extent that is that they're both independent clauses, they're therefore equal. They're both independent. But contextually, the first independent clause usually feels a little bit different in scope or weight than the second independent clause. For the most part, you'll see the relationship between the two independent clauses as a kind of type-token relationship. So the first one will be a little bit more broad. It'll introduce a broad idea. And then in the second half, you'll have delivered a token of that broad type, which just means that you'll have something a little bit more specific, a specific example that is of that more sort of general relation that comes on the first half. By type token relation, let me just be a little bit more clear about the phraseology that I'm using. This type token distinction is pretty straightforward once you get the hang of it. If you have a big circle of a certain type, within that circle, there are various tokens, right? There are many, for example, different types of balls. We have beach balls, we have soccer balls, we have golf balls, etc. All of these different types of balls are tokens of the general type, which is the general type of ball, right? The ball is a larger type, and within that type, we have different examples of that type. Those are the tokens. We can maybe think about this in a little bit more of an ideological way. Governments are a general type of thing to think about, or a general type of idea. Within that general type of idea, there are different sort of flavors of thought. There's federations, that's a type of government. There's monarchies, that's also a type of government. There's republics, of course, and democracies and all of that. Those are different examples. They're different tokens of the general type, which is government. We can see this with bicycles, and you can think about property as a token of a type. Within the class bicycles, we have my bike, you also have your bike, and Earl has his bike. All of these different bikes are examples of the larger type bike, but they're denominated in a certain kind of way by these pronouns. And then just as one final example, we have a general type, which is letters. And then within that general type, we can have different examples. Maybe we have this set of English letters, A, B, C, D, E, blah, 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 X, Y, Z. We can have different, maybe Arabic letters or Cyrillic letters or that kind of thing. But within the type of letters, we can have the set of tokens, which is the English language letters, or I guess Romance languages more broadly. The type token distinction is really useful because I think it illustrates the power of the colon. Tokens, again, just to sum up, are examples of a certain type. Back to our exposition of colons as introductory agents within a sentence. Our first sub-example, which we're still in despite my side tangent, is that colons can relate two independent clauses to one another in a consequential kind of fashion. So generally speaking, the pattern that you'll see is the first, what comes just before the colon, there'll be a sort of general, there'll be a kind of general principle, and then there'll be a kind of, if-then, implied if-then statement. There'll be a token of that type. When you have this kind of relation, usually the colon can stand in for the phrase it is or they are. Let me give you an example just so it's clear what exactly I mean. I've taken this, by the way, from the UNC Writing Center website, which I'll link in the description to this video. It's a really phenomenal website. I encourage you to check it out. It says basically everything that I'm saying here, just in a different form. So if you want to have a reference that you can go back to without having to watch a video, definitely click that. Okay, anyways, our example is life is like a puzzle, half the fun is in trying to work it out. So we have life is like a puzzle. That's the sort of, metaphor is the governing independent thought that sort of unites the two. And then on the second half, we have another independent clause that is syntactically equal because, again, they're both independent. The B part in this consequential relation usually elaborates on that A part in the idea that's proposed in that A section. The colon in this example sentence operates as a kind of logical connector between the two phrases. It's not necessarily implying chronological order or necessarily sequential order. That's why I've said it's consequentially related independent clauses and phrases. The colon is a logical operator to the extent that once you read the entire chunk, so chunk A and chunk B together, you realize that chunk B is fleshing out chunk A. And that's what I mean by the colon in this case is a logical operator. This is like really getting into the weeds here. You just need to know that the colon can connect two related ideas that are syntactically equal, which is just to say you can put an independent clause on the first half and then add a colon and then connect it to a related independent clause on the other half, and that's totally fine. Usually when you do that kind of thing, the colon in that case allows B to summarize or sharpen or explain part A. but that's not always the case. Just that's a good rule of thumb, though. Now we can get to the second introductory function of the colon, which is it can introduce a list or a quotation or an example. So chunk A is usually an independent clause. It has to be, and then we put a colon, and then we have any kind of thing that's fleshing it out. So again, the colon is allowing chunk A to introduce whatever comes right after it. Now, you'll note that lists, quotations, and usually examples are incomplete thoughts and clauses. That is, they can't stand on their own, and anything that can't stand on its own is rather dependent. So everything that comes in the second introductory function of the colon, everything that comes in the B chunk is dependent on chunk A. So it's not necessarily equivalent. So the colon in this case does not necessarily indicate an equal relation between the two things. It's much more like that type token discussion I had earlier in the video. A good way to read colons that happen in this case are to read them as such as. So if we have independent chunk A, such as, list item A, list item B, list item C. I'm going to get to an example of what exactly I mean by all of that in just a moment. For now, you just need to keep in mind that the colon, if it's operating in the second introductory function or functionality, it's allowing B to evidence A, to make A known or to elaborate on A in a similar kind of way. In this first introductory function, the colon can join two independent clauses to one another. Usually the thing that's coming after the colon summarizes or sharpens everything that's coming before it. And then in the second introductory function, an independent clause can be conjoined to some kind of incomplete idea or phrase or dependent phrase or whatever in order to illuminate whatever comes before it as well. Just again, to recapitulate everything we've learned thus far. We have our semicolon and our colon. The thing that you need to absolutely drill into your brains is the fact that the two are not equivalent. You can't interchange one for the other, and that they both have very separate functions. The semicolon can be used anywhere that you use a period, an exclamation point, or a question mark. On the other hand, the colon is a little bit weaker. It's somewhere, within the strength ballpark of an M dash, but again, they're certainly not equivalent to semicolons. Whereas the semicolons can conjoin, as I said, two independent clauses to one another. They cannot join an independent clause to a dependent clause. Only commas can do that. Colons, on the other hand, can conjoin an independent clause or a full sentence to some kind of independent clause. You can do that one to the other. And then you also have that independent clause conjoined to some kind of incomplete thought or phrase or idea that serves as a kind of evidence for the first. In the second arrangement, obviously, the incomplete thought or phrase idea is usually a list or a quotation or an example of what's coming before it. This is the colon's introductory function operating in an evidentiary kind of way. And then in the independent to independent relation, the colon is making one introduce the other, but it's operating in an expository kind of way. It exposes one to the other. It's exposing the logic or the consequential relation again. Now that I've rehearsed all of that in extremely theoretical detail, I'd like to illuminate everything with an example sentence. The example sentence also highlights an important exception to the way that we can use semicolons. This caveat is rather straightforward. You can use semicolons to separate items within a list. So again, whereas the colon is never equivalent to a comma, sometimes the semicolon can be equivalent to the comma. That's not to say it always is. Generally speaking, you'll see the semicolon most often used in place of a period. But again, just occasionally you can have a kind of boutique usage where you're swapping the semicolon in and out for commas between items within a single list. Let me be a little bit more concrete about what exactly I mean by that or why exactly it's useful. So let's take, for example, the sentence, I'll have pickles, ketchup, and onions. This is what I like to have on my cheeseburgers, generally speaking. I have three sort of sub-items here within the object. Pickles is item number 1, ketchup is item number 2, and onions is item number 3. But say, for example, I want to elaborate on my items here. I really only like pickles if they're dill pickles. So I'll say I'll have pickles, but only if they're dill pickles. Similarly, I want to elaborate on item number 2. I actually kind of like mustard just as much as I like ketchup. It depends on what kind of mood I'm in. So my second item, I really wanted to read something like ketchup or mustard. And then the third item, I also kind of like, depending on the cheese or whatever, I don't really have a huge preference on whether or not my onions are fried or sauteed. So I'd like to swap in, fried or sauteed onions for that third item. If we rewrite our sentence, then we get this whole mega sentence. I'll have pickles, but only if they're dill, ketchup or mustard, and fried or sauteed onions. This is a long sentence, but it's much more informative because it gives the chef a little bit more information about my preferences and that kind of thing. We're still preserving our 3 chunks, pickles, but only if they're dill is number 1, and then ketchup or mustard, that's number 2, and then fried or sauteed onions, that's chunk number 3. We've also, as you can see, kept our 2 commas, which separate item number 1 from number 2, and then also item number 2 from number 3. The issue, however, arises with the fact that we have a third comma, but we're not necessarily using this third comma in the same way that we're using the latter 2 commas, the ones between items 1 and 2. This comma happens within item number 1. This is, again, the function of this comma differs from the function of the 2 other commas within the sentence. So this is where the semicolon comes in order to differentiate the function of all of these commas. We can swap in the semicolon instead of the commas that differentiate one chunk from another chunk. As it is right now with all the commas, the chunks are really difficult to sort of skim and differentiate. It's really great if you can just sort of see the chunks by looking at them. So again, this caveat, which is that occasionally you can use semicolons in place of commas if you're trying to differentiate items from a list. This is when this caveat comes very much in handy. If we swap in a semicolon for the commas that are differentiating chunks within a list, this will preserve the distinction between each of the chunks. So our new sentence reads, I'll have pickles, but only if they're dill, ketchup or mustard, and fried or sauteed onions. Again, we have all of our chunks preserved, and each of the punctuation marks within the sentence is very nicely differentiated according to its function. We have our 2 semicolons. These are differentiating list items. And then that comma that we have right in the middle between the word pickle and but, that's operating within that first chunk. So again, just to be sure that we're clear, the semicolon can very occasionally, and again, this is a boutique usage, it can occasionally be swapped in for a comma. But this occasion only occurs with complex list items or lists that are complex. Okay, that was a lot of information. Let me give you some guidelines that could help you differentiate between all of these different functions. We have our first device that we've learned about, which is the semicolon. The semicolon usually is equivalent to a period. Periods obviously are also equivalent to exclamation points and question marks, so you can swap in a semicolon for those too sometimes. Occasionally, and again, this is just very occasional, you can also swap a semicolon in for a comma. This happens only when there's a list. So this is to separate distinct items, item 1 from item 2 from item 3 within the same list. If you have maybe chunks that are different word lengths, or have weird chunks that are different word lengths, or that themselves incorporate commas into, you can swap in a semicolon in order to chunk things out a little bit more easily for your reader. Our second punctuation mark is the colon. Colons are not equivalent to a period. They're also therefore not equivalent to a exclamation point or a question mark, or by that logic also a semicolon. So colons are not equivalent to a semicolon. You can't use one for the other. They are not equivalent. Colons have 2 functions. The first is an expository function. Chunk B sometimes can summarize or sharpen or otherwise explain chunk A. And then the other introductory function is an evidentiary mode. Colons can allow chunk B, which is like a list or a quotation or an example, to become evidence in support of chunk A, whatever's coming, in other words, just before the colon. We can apply these 2 different guidelines in slightly different ways to our own independent and dependent clauses. So again, semicolons can join 2 full sentences, which means they can join 2 independent clauses. Colons can do the same thing as semicolons, but they can also, and this is their differentiating function, this is how they're different from semicolons, they can conjoin an independent clause to some kind of exposition or evidence of that independent clause. So the other half doesn't necessarily need to be, in other words, an independent chunk on its own. This expository or evidentiary string of text can be an incomplete thought or incomplete sentence or incomplete phrase. So that's a little bit freer on the other end, if you will. I hope this video describing the differences between semicolons and colons has been useful to you. If you are totally lost, which I don't blame you because this video is a little scattered, I would encourage you to check out the link that I've included in the description to this video. It's a really beautiful introduction to the differences between these two things, and it lines up rather nicely with what I've presented here. That's all I have for now. I hope you have a good day. Goodbye.